Okay guys, so you've made it to the second video. I am just going to show you something real quick. You don't need to write this down currently, but where we left off in our last video is we looked at the light-dependent reactions. So the first stage of photosynthesis. We're looking at like what's going on behind the scenes to help us create these products we know are in our formula. So I'm going to write the formula out. We have 6 CO2 molecules plus 6 water molecules going into our plant, and we end up with 6 oxygen molecules released into the atmosphere and 1 molecule of glucose every time this process happens, C6H12O6. Okay? We also know that we have some light energy on this side helping the reaction to occur. So in the light-dependent reactions that we just learned about in video 1, we saw how light and water were involved. We saw that light energy split the water apart, released some electrons filled with energy, stored in 2 energy carriers, and carried to our next process we're about to talk about. And we also saw some oxygen produced that was released into the atmosphere. So we've seen what's going on with those molecules behind the scenes, but what about carbon dioxide and glucose? What is going on with those? So we're going to see these guys here in the light independent reactions. So in the corner, I continued on a new page and I have it set up so it's Cornell style notes. I'm going to write stage 2. And we are going to answer the question of what happens in the light independent reactions. These are also called the Calvin cycle, but light independent means they don't depend directly on light. Even though they depend on the light dependent reactions, they themselves don't require light. So like I said, I like to always kind of box in my vocab words, make them really clear. Just one vocab word with a lot behind the scenes. Sorry. We're going to start off the same way we did with our other one. We're going to start off with the goal. What is the goal of this part of photosynthesis, right? So the first part, photo, and the word photosynthesis means light. We just saw how light was used. Now we're in the synthesis part. The whole goal of photosynthesis is to make sugars, and that happens here. So before we just used the light to make ATP and NADPH, now we're going to use those to make sugars. Or glucose molecules, okay? Chemical energy. Where does this take place? Well, we started in our last portion of the process in the thylakoids, those little green discs in a chloroplast. Now we're moving into the stroma. Okay, so if we draw our chloroplasts, we draw some thylakoid. We are right here in the stroma, the space around them. So the ATP and the NADPH from the light-dependent reactions are going to pop out of the thylakoid and into the stroma for these reactions. That's where they are headed. The inputs of this process are ATP and NADPH coming from the thylakoid, coming from the light-dependent reactions filled with that energy of initially from the sunlight. So I'm going to write just underneath them from light dependent reactions. So that says from light dependent reactions. I know this looks like I have something under my nail, but I don't. It's just a pen mark. I'm just going to make that clear. Anyways, and the other thing that's coming in here is CO2. I'm going to box CO2 because this is one of our main inputs of photosynthesis being used up in this reaction, okay, or being rearranged, I should say. We never have matter disappear. So the outputs, what comes out of this process, is one thing: glucose, sugars. 1 molecule every time this cycle happens. Okay. So while these are called the light-independent reactions, they don't depend on light directly. They don't happen in the dark either. It's not like the dark reactions. It doesn't need to be dark outside for these to happen. They just don't need light necessarily to occur, okay, or directly. So it can still happen during the day. So we're making glucose. So now we need our overview. And here it is, step 1. So in step 1, we're going to start by using the energy from ATP and NADPH, our energy carriers. These are just like molecules, just like when we look at CO2 and H2O, they're just a different type of molecule. And we're going to use that energy to build a sugar molecule, which is going to store chemical energy. And how this is done is through a series of, I'm going to change that word, through a cycle. Oh, Siri heard me. How funny is that? Through a cycle of chemical reactions. So I'm just going to draw like a little circle with arrows to show it's a cycle, okay? So we're going to use that energy from the light-dependent reactions, and we are going to build a sugar molecule to store that chemical energy. But how this happens, how this is stored, is the CO2 is going to come in, it's going to be rearranged, the carbons, the oxygens, in a bunch of different steps with a bunch of help from ATP and NADPH and a bunch of enzymes, just these little proteins that do work in our body. And eventually we're going to end up with some sugar, and this process keeps happening over and over and over again. So there's lots of steps. It's a very complex cycle. And 2, the glucose/sugars are used to build starches, which is energy storage, and cellulose, plant cell walls. If we look at a cell of a plant, it has this nice sturdy cell wall, or that glucose can be used for cellular respiration, which will be our next unit, making that usable energy. Those are how the sugars can be used or stored away, okay? Just a reminder with starches and cellulose, I'm just going to draw over here. If we have one glucose molecule, these are going to be a bunch of glucose molecules put together, stored away in kind of like this compact manner as one giant molecule that can be broken down anytime the plant needs to access that glucose. Okay, so let's do our diagram. We're going to label our diagram the light independent reactions, and I'm also just going to write here the Calvin cycle. You'll hear this name a lot. It's another name for them. Okay, so we're going to start off with the same thing we did last time. We are going to draw a little tiny chloroplast along the side over here with its thylakoid. Okay, and we are zooming in on this empty space here. Not fully empty, but the space around the thylakoids called the stroma. And so let's zoom into there. Just kind of say, we'll just use black to like show we're not in like a green portion right now. So just zoom in, we'll do a square here. Kind of zooming in. Okay, so again, we want to start with what are our major inputs coming into here and what's our major output. So here we can see carbon dioxide is our major input coming in, and glucose is our major output. So we're going to use like one color to show these are our major guys, the parts we see in the formula, in the big picture. So we have 6 carbon dioxide molecules, CO2. Where are they coming from? from the atmosphere. They came in through the stomata. And I'm going to draw a little molecule of CO2, 1 carbon, 2 oxygen. We have 6 of those coming in, and we're going to end up with 1 glucose molecule coming out. Okay? Again, tons of chloroplasts all over the plant are having this process occur. This is just our second step behind the scenes of what's going on to create our outputs. The light-independent reaction. So sugar comes out. And I want to highlight this word sugar or glucose because we know this stores energy, chemical energy. If you don't know by now that sugar stores chemical energy, write that down, chemical energy. Okay. And what it's going to look like is it's a 6 carbon molecule. So 6 carbons. And those 6 carbons have all these hydrogens, oxygens poking off of them, but we'll leave it like that for now. And it's stored or used by the plant. Stored in or used by the plant. Okay, chemical energy, I'm writing that. Chemical energy is stored in these bonds of the sugar molecule, in these carbon-to-carbon bonds. All right, so those are our 2 major guys. And remember, use your arrows to show movement. So this is coming out. And now we're going to use our little guys from the light-dependent reactions. I'm going to add them in up here. So we know we also have ATP and NADPH from the light-dependent reactions coming on in. Okay. Have them in a lighter blue to show that it's not like the full deal. They're not the major guys, but they're there. I'm going to use my yellow to show they're carrying that energy from the electrons that initially came from the sun. And I am going to show what's going on in here. So I'm going to draw a couple of like thylakoid along the side so we can see that they're in here, but we're not in those. We're in this empty space in between, and what's going on in here is this cycle. Okay, so carbon dioxide is going to go into this cycle. Glucose is going to pop out with the help of the energy from these guys and some enzymes. I'm just going to have you write this name of one of the major enzymes. It's called rubisco. We'll see it come up in our lab, but rubisco is going to be in there helping rearrange these carbons. Okay, the last thing I want us to do is just label this space as the stroma. The space between thylakoids. And there you have it. So no light is directly needed here, but we have the energy initially from the sun's light in these light-independent reactions, okay? So now we have completely seen what happened in photosynthesis. We started off with the light-dependent reactions using these 2 inputs, producing this output and giving some energy to be carried over to our light-independent reactions where carbon dioxide gets rearranged into glucose with the help of some other factors from those light-dependent reactions. So you have officially finished these notes. We'll do a summary together tomorrow.